Let's now move on to the keynote address of this evening. In this segment, our keynote speaker will explore opportunities through case studies and existing successful public-private partnerships on climate adaptation and mitigation from around the world. To discuss and suggest climate investment options for Sri Lanka and perhaps South Asia, we have with us Dr. Nambi Appadurai, the head of Adaptation Strategy for the Climate Resilience Practice and World Resource Institute, India. Dr. Appadurai's work has focused mainly on climate risk management and adaptation in Asia and Africa, working with communities and government officials to support climate risk mainstreaming. He is currently exploring ways to integrate adaptation into development processes at the national and community levels. Please welcome Dr. Nambi Appadurai.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I'd like to thank Dilan and Dilmah for bringing me here. Dil in Hindi means conviction and heart and passion. So this is a deadly combination with Dil and Dilan. I'm sure could do something for this country. And you're in the right direction, taking the right steps. And it's very hard to it's always a joy to come here to Sri Lanka because after a year I'm here this time. I see a lot of changes. We talk about climate change. For a moment, I thought I'm landing in China. Now that's a different discussion for a different forum, but certainly that's a huge change what I saw. It's always good to go after so many wise words have been said. So my job is more simplified. I see a lot of things what I want to kind of outline has been said. It doesn't mean that I should stop in the sense that this is a subject which needs reiteration. And somewhat it's stating the obvious in many sense, but still it is certainly it's worth the repetition because the climate subject is certainly a complex one, and it takes time to kind of understand. This is kind of outline of my presentation. I'll just provide an overview, then talk a little bit about the impacts and consequences, draw your attention to the recent literature. That's important to understand what's going on today. And then talk about some of the response options, preparing for new normals. We have to accept that we are in a world that will have new normals, and how to deal with them is the biggest question. And then talk something about the business. Again, at the outset, I want to tell you that I am no private sector specialist. I'm more trained in resilience and management, and that's my core area of work for about a decade. So I will rather stick to what I know, and then reflect on, within that context, what business means within this context. So, and then touch upon some of the issues which could provide some solutions for us to move ahead. It's interesting, it just only goes to prove that it's happening. Climate change is now, and it's here to stay. And this morning, I woke up to need to read this news, and Daily Mirror, I think. So wherever you are, whichever part of the continent, you get to hear and listen about climate change wherever you go. I've been keeping a record of this in my world travel, to some extent, to the extent possible. I've seen this happening everywhere, and everywhere being, in the sense that it has become a big buzzword. It's a word that resonates with everybody today. Though the science is a bit complex, we know the experiential knowledge is so much there, and people could easily relate to today. There are different global challenges, as you know, population growth, poverty, urbanization. These are all huge challenges, and climate change is part of it. And it is only a second order or third order challenge, but still it has a huge impact on human lives because it affects the very building blocks of human survival. That's the reason it gets so much of attention today, as you all know. There's nothing new, but I just want to reiterate the point why we are where we are today. This is a recent study, a report published by the World Bank, which is very interesting in the sense that it looks at the impacts of climate change, the various parameters, particularly temperature and rainfall, on living standards of people. This is more specifically focused on the South Asian continent. I thought it's just released about a couple of months back in India. I was part of the panel which discussed this report. Very interesting report. It only looks at from the hotspots perspective, both two scenarios it draws. One is the business as usual scenario, and what happens in the carbon intensive scenario. So it has some lessons for this continent. Particularly, look at the Sri Lankan map. There are hotspots. What has been identified as hotspots is northern and northwestern provinces emerge as two top hotspots, followed by less densely populated north central province, which very much corroborates to the news what I read in the morning. It's happening there, the droughts and other things. So I don't want to kind of go into this, just to give a flavor of what's happening. Already it's been talked about, but South Asian continent is really at some level of danger, with sea level rise, and particularly a country like India, where disasters are very much prone. We see the intensity and frequency of disasters going up. You name it, you find it there. You talk about droughts, floods, earthquakes, landslides, everything there. I had an interesting slide. Somehow I couldn't get hold of that. Somewhere I missed it. If you could overlap the past 10 years of flood over the past 10 years of drought, there is not, 10 years of information on climate change, climate variability, then you'll see there is not even a single year which is paired. If you just overlay them, it is kind of alternating droughts and floods and stuff. So that's that speaks for itself. And now moving on to the major response option. As you all know, this is nothing new. Mitigation, adaptation are the two response options what we have. Mitigation, we spent decades spending on that. It's a very politically charged issue, as you all know. It's between the haves and have-nots, developed versus developing countries. The dust is kind of settled, though it is not to the to satisfaction of everybody with Paris deal. But still a long way to go. There are certain unsettled issues as well. But then adaptation is just really is not much untouched. It's mostly untouched, in the sense that it is because it is a development issue. Adaptation is a very complex issue. Cannot be one solution for adaptation. So still the world is grappling with this in terms of understanding that and providing the right kind of resources. It's still a long way to go there. It's a work in progress, I would say. And then this is a good way of looking at it, because good science leads to good planning. Good information leads to good planning. So whatever we got starting point for any adaptation action is good information. And the possible range of impacts on different sectors. But that information is not easy to come by, as you know. It's very difficult to, and also it's a moving target. Adaptation is a moving target. So it's not easy. Based on those information, you plan and then try to implement the projects. What we discussed today had a lot of resonance in very practical solutions what you have there. But then there's one thing to have those things, the pilot tested and stuff, but then one has to really monitor and evaluate those things to provide the feedback loop. I'll tell you one thing, a very simple example. In India, climate information services have really advanced to a large extent with the technology and the farmers using the mobile phones and stuff. There is a good forecast coming up on a day in and day out, seasonal forecasts. All those things are very good, well established. A lot of agriculture universities contribute to that, education institutions. But then, nobody checks how the farmer is using that information. The utility value of the information has not been really looked at. That is a very important thing. Unless you learn what is going on in the field, what are the challenges there, you cannot improvise. So that feedback loop becomes very, very important. And adaptation being a moving target, it's even more essential to be cognizant of the surroundings and what is in it, what have we done so far, what results it has yielded. All those things have to be looked comprehensively. That mechanism has to be really established. It is applicable universally. And I'm not going to talk much about this because what vulnerability means, and the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity are the three components. It's a function of that. And then particularly I'm draw your attention to the socioeconomic scenarios and climate scenarios. These are two components which pretty much provide the information for us to build. So that's very, very critical when you talk about it, understanding the social dynamics of it. And also a lot of factors like social capital come into play today. We have time and again we witness the value of that, which has not been really factored much when we talk about adaptive capacity. It's a function of finance, technology, and social capital. That element has not been studied very well, whereas traditionally for this part of the world, I would say the social networks have helped us in many ways. In tsunami, you've seen that in how people assemble, help themselves. In a disaster sense, people have looked at it disaster reduction sense, but then not in adaptation. It's because some of them are slow onset events, droughts particularly. You don't even realize there is drought. So that social network, the seed exchange mechanism, whatever you had, there's a rich repository of knowledge in this continent and in this part of the world. So one has to tap that. That's an important linkage. And this is just to show an example of climate change as direct impact as well as indirect impacts. We often talk about the direct impacts, which are very visible. Even in the coastal areas, always get the due, because the visibility after a cyclone strikes, normally it's all known, the media is after that and they're showing what they want to show. But then the slow onset even never gets it. So there are two components. When I talk about agriculture context, there are direct impacts, which is to do with the physiology of the plants and plant yields and stuff, which is very much visible there. Whereas indirect effects like pest, when the temperature goes up, the pest becomes an issue. So that has not been really, of course we are studying that, but it is not a direct kind of a visibility. So those kind of things have to be really looked at. So whatever sector we are working, we have to really look at both the direct and indirect impacts. That's the kind of a message I want to convey here. And key to managing risks, assessing vulnerability, as I told you, is the first step. Engaging the stakeholders also is very critical, in terms of, and also the characterization of the adaptive capacity, as I talked about earlier. There are two framings of adaptation. One, the UNFCCC-led framing, which is driven by the UNFCCC. It is got into the muddied politics, as you know. It is all about who gets the money, how much, who has to say, those kind of questions, and whether it is good to fund adaptation. These are some of the questions. The politics, there is a heavy politics there. The development framing is also important, because adaptation is pretty much embedded in development. Whatever we do, a good development leads to good adaptation. So it is nothing but, to my knowledge, it's kind of, climate-proof development is adaptation. So in the sense that that's kind of gaining ground today, but both framings are valid, because the developing countries need the money. So we need to really fight for our case within the UNFCCC system. So yeah, these are the two framings. And the evolution of the climate change adaptation actions, it is from the first generation to where we are today, some 20 years back. It's a top-down, completely driven by scientific information. That's all that. Then second generation, we looked at how to kind of understand vulnerabilities, particularly looking at bottom-up. People's perspective as built in participatory vulnerability assessment. Or those kind of techniques and tools came in. And then third generation, it's a mix of these two things. Now we are far more focused on, today, it's about action-based analysis, which is very critical. In the sense that, like the pilot projects, what we talked about, what do we learn from that? What lessons it has to take adaptation from a incremental change to bring in transformative change. That is the kind of a phase we are in. There are a lot of examples around the world, from Asia to Africa particularly, have contributed. There are wonderful examples from Bangladesh. It's a big test lab for adaptation. But then how do we kind of, these are small pilots scattered around the continent. How do you kind of scale that? What is the missing link there? How to be understood? So that is the phase we are into now. And moving on to the global adaptation milestones, there are several events, as you know. Chronologically look at it, from NAPAS to today we are talking about NDCs, and it has come a long way. Today GCF is found to be a very good mechanism for funding climate actions, particularly given the fact that it is going to contribute 50% of money to adaptation and 50% to mitigation. Again, the good intentions, but the kitty is still growing, and we haven't really got the kind of money what we needed to fund adaptation. But GCF decisions are largely shaped by what has happened over the past 2-3 decades, 2 decades at least, to learn from that, which really shaped. Then, who are the audiences? We are also kind of target this thing, whatever the message was sent has to be targeted to the different audiences. There are people where adaptation isn't my job. There are people who are there, who was wondering, and not completely understanding the adaptation dynamics. So we need to really cater to their needs and, to kind of, send some clear messages to them. And I need help, I don't know what to do. Most of us are into that category of people, There are lots of, because of the very multidimensional nature of, multidisciplinary nature of adaptation. When we talk about agriculture, we cannot segregate water. That's the way it is. When you talk about urban systems, we cannot ignore ecosystems, peri-urban stuff. So all those things are very much interlinked. So there is a genuine confusion there. How do you kind of tease out? It's the biggest challenge what you see in adaptation. And climate changes, there are the naysayers, field is stagnated, we have plateaued, there's nothing much we can do about it. A resigned attitude. Those are some of the kind of audiences also we find. So approach to move the needle with will differ from different people and different audiences. So what do we know so far? This is, I'll go back, sorry. So the importance of planning, strengthening, enabling environments for adaptations and mainstreaming adaptation into development is one of the key things. There are certain things we know, certain things we don't really have understood clearly. And the effectiveness of impact of adaptation action also has to be, we need to a little more probe about that. That's why the M&D systems becomes very important. The M&D system within adaptation context has not been very strong enough. It's still a developing area, evolving area. We have borrowed a lot of things from the development literature, particularly looking at M&D for the development experiences. It has some lessons for us within the adaptation context. And then there are adaptation limits as well, limits to adaptation. Beyond a certain period, what is today's adaptation might turn into a maladaptation after some time. One has to be wary of that fact. Really, that's very difficult to understand, but then still it is very important to know because we can't make investments in the wrong sectors and wrong places. Then adaptation priorities, largely agriculture, water and coastal and health are the key areas across the world. You could see that these are the areas where adaptation needs are there. And then we are again moving into, this is well understood to some extent, but then we are moving into investments in capacity building, governance, knowledge management. These are other cross-cutting areas which needs attention today. How do you consolidate what you learned? It's also an important thing. And how do you disseminate and share information becomes critical. So then talking about adaptation finance, global costs, we don't have a good estimate of adaptation costs. That's why we are also losing out in negotiations. A lot of times the developing countries ask you to come out with a clear figure, knowing pretty well it is such a matrixed kind of a system. So it's very difficult. There is no clear metrics to measure adaptation, unlike mitigation, which is a very linear path. You have a GSD protocol you can easily measure, whereas that's not possible within the global cost. And also there are different numbers floating around. One is not too sure, but only it's clear that there is a huge gap there, and we need to address that. That's what I would conclude rather than putting numbers there. There are different studies from World Bank, UNEP. There are other agencies like McKinsey and other people has also done some good work on that. So mostly the finance comes from DFIs, the Development Finance Institutes, and governments have started investing more and more. India has started its own National Adaptation Fund. But still, these are peanuts, but still, nevertheless, it's very important. Because the action is taking place today, what we need is a sub-national level action today. So that becomes very critical that investments, what we generate within the country also has to be spent effectively. These are some of the primary questions. Why would the private enterprises typically choose to invest in adaptation measures? For their own interest first. Oftentimes there is a huge issue looking at as a public sector domain. Adaptation is seen as a public sector domain. That's the issue mostly, because it has got some social implications, and there is no cash flow in return. So business people really don't want to venture into something which is not that there are CSR and other things they are doing in a nice way, but where there is no direct returns, it's very difficult to comprehend that. These are three questions to reduce physical, three kind of solutions. Basically to reduce physical climate risks directly, and to transfer the risk through insurance, or to capitalize on a new business opportunity. These are the three important things which could drive the private sector to do adaptation. There are positive externalities. As I mentioned to you, private investments generate benefits to society that do not generate additional cash flows. So that might be one of the barriers. And secondly, the imperfect capital markets. which enables the long-term credit is not available for adaptation-related. Generally, it's very difficult to get long-term because the long-term benefits have not been projected effectively because there's information asymmetry as well there. Because unless you know what you're doing, you cannot invest. That's important to have that kind of a wide range of information to make a choice out of it. So that is also a huge barrier for private sector to enter into adaptation-related activities. Then policy and regulatory measures, which may not be favorable for the private sector. There is not much of incentives there. That is, again, it has to be revisited. And there are some social and cultural barriers as well. It depends on the kind of country you're working in. It differs from place to place. And technological and financial barrier, as I mentioned to you earlier, some of them, as I told you, some of the technology is in public domain, so there is no real interest to kind of develop that. But having said that, you also realize that renewable energy has given this shown a pathway. It's a massive kind of investment taking place across the world, as you know. India is also leading this. So there are instances. One of the things I just want to mention here is a very interesting study by FAO. You have seen this. There are so many good studies being done from this country, particularly looking at the tea industry. It's a very recent report. In 2016 is published. They systematically looked at different tea industries in this part of the world to see how it is and where adaptation strategies could be brought in. For that, they did an analysis, looked at the projections, the understanding the physiology of those things, the landscape thoroughly, soil, water, all those things, and came out with certain measures. I just want to show this as an example because every single sector has to be looked at it. Within the agriculture sector or forestry sector, every single, it so happened that in 2009, when Jairam Ramesh was the environment minister of our country, he asked me to give him some kind of inputs on the impact of climate change on plantations. So hardly I could find any literature. That is really, we have come a long way in this 10 years, but still those are early days, and absolutely only then I also realized, how much of effort is needed, particularly rubber, coffee, whatever is available a bit on coffee, but not on rubber, cardamom. There are other spice crops, which needs this kind of a thing. So that particularly private sector have to look, private sector, this information is very, very important for them to further the business. So these are some of the strategies they came out with, the FAO study looks at. Now moving on to the core area, what Dilmah has asked me to focus on, the threats, responses, and opportunities. I look at from these 6 categories. I try to kind of, have a framework applied to these 6 categories of information, because these are the categories which is really impacted in a business sense. Even otherwise it is, but still within a business sense it means a lot. People, premises, and processes. One has to look how the threats are, what are the kind of responses what we have today, and what are the opportunities that are existing. In markets, finance, and logistics. There might be beyond this, but then to my knowledge, these are very, very critical and important things. So I came out with a kind of a framework. When you talk about people, people are the first in line. Absolutely, the lives and livelihoods are in danger. Certainly, one has to focus. It applies to the labor class and the laborers who are involved in the private sector operations. So it might lead to loss of labor hour. I'm not going to really detail, to read everything there, but it is important to have this framework and think through this process so that you understand where the gaps are. At least it gives some idea of where we are going. The increase in waterborne diseases during floods. At the other end, you also see there are a lot of opportunities for the healthcare opening up. Not at the cost of people, but then I'm saying, and there's an opportunity there. So migration relocation also is happening. Particularly one good example from India is, in the Himachal Pradesh, in Uttarakhand district, we saw the apple trees are moving up. With high rise in temperature, the higher elevation, the apple crops could not be viable for cultivation in those particular altitudes. So nature also has its own adaptation mechanisms, as you know. It's not only everything is man-made, so it is also moving up. So what happens to the farmers and the people who've been living with that provides a livelihood for those people. So how do we deal with this problem? That's a big question. There is a good opportunity, and they've demonstrated. It's a very good example. Almost for 4 or 5 years, people have been grappling with this. They cannot find jobs. People are migrating continuously. And there came some business knowledge from Netherlands came up. Because the main migration was because I mean, the loss of production was because the chilling days is very critical for Apple. The number of chilling days have come down, so they cannot really produce good quality apples there. So over a period of time, it is also kind of it's losing ground. So there was a nice small bushy apple which came from Netherlands, which has a reduced chilling period. So some business acumen was there, so they brought in, and now they back to square one in terms of cultivation. So that's a good example of how vigilant one has to be and try to experiment ideas. That's critical, and only private sector could afford to do that. They could bring in those networks and try to experiment certain things, and they kind of on the pathway to re-establish the apple cultivation there. So also with certain crops and certain sectors, the skill sets also go away once people migrate. A lot of agriculture you see as masons today in cities, most of them in India. So the skill sets they also have to retooled in many sense. There should be, somebody talked about the importance of curriculum development. That is also critical. So people-centric, imagine about these small businesses, enterprises like the self-help groups in India. There are thousands of networks of self-help groups. This has an impact on them in a very big way. So these have to be looked up. Certainly it's people-centric, and we should see what the impacts are, what are the current remedies are, and where are we going there, where are we going from here, and what the opportunities exist. Again, in terms of infrastructure, the premises increased maintenance work from damage. It's one of the very obvious stuff what you see. So it needs more trained workforce. Change in design and structure, which is heat tolerant and other things. So I have to take another 2 minutes. I lost considerable time. I hope show some consideration. Good, thanks. I won't stretch it too long. I just want to kind of show you these slides. So engineering, design, architecture, and planning, these are some of the opportunities what you see, particularly in the infrastructure domain. And markets, supply chain, somebody talked about supply chain this morning. Again, it has been impacted in a very big way. So climate proofing of the roads becomes a very important thing. And maintaining a steady supply of markets to markets is very critical. To maintain that, we need to take certain steps, which is important. And increased business opportunity in some sectors as a result of extended tourist season, as you know, when faces climate change, it brings a lot of fancy ideas out there. Siberia becoming a tropical area, and there are a lot of fancy things there. I don't know whether we will be there yet, but we see some moderate changes which is happening. One has to adapt to that, and it also opens door in some sense. So we have to really take advantage of that. Finance, again, will increase in potential for increase. Insurance premiums happens. So insurance industry is already doing very well with the climate stuff, but then it needs to see some good products coming out, which is tailor-made for specific sectors of people. That's important. And I will circulate this because want of time, I cannot go through everything, but it has some kind of cues how we could organize ourselves. So again, processes, a lot of changes have to be brought in processes, particularly the investment in the R&D becomes very important. How efficiently you could run in the climate change scenario. Whatever the products, what you're producing has to be effectively and efficiently delivered. So that's the essence of it. And logistics, I talked about, it kind of covers everything. So developing new diverse networks of suppliers, that becomes very critical. This is another interesting slide, which is a very recent study, again, 2017 study. IFC has come out with this, identified sectors for the South Asian region. What are the sectors for investment? And I don't know, probably some of you would have seen this, and across the countries, in South Asia, you find where the investments are, what kind of, investment gaps are there, how to address that. It runs to billions from now to 2030. You see the key sectors listed there. Then this is specifically for Sri Lanka. It loses about 1.2% of annual GDP growth by 2050. That's what it says. And then there are key sectors, water, transport, some of them identified here. And it requires about $18 billion of investment potential is there between 2018 and 30. That report also talks about some of the other details. If you could go through that, you'll find some interesting information there. And in India, these are some of the primary sectors in the priority areas. I'm just going to list out. peri-urban resilience, smart cities program is across the world. You see urbanization taking place and governments taking measures. There's a huge role for the private sector to play here. Absolutely, there's no doubt in terms of providing the right technology, building climate-proof infrastructure, buildings, green buildings, whatnot. I mean, again, communication technology, climate information technologies, and food waste management is another thing where we could really look into. These are primarily sectors where private sector is really very much involved. Traditionally, as well as with the climate context, it becomes all the more essential for people to concentrate a little more on these areas. So Indian example, we did a small survey within Tamil Nadu. We found insurance certainly as a big opening. Drip irrigation is another area where private sector is heavily involved, and there is enough scope to expand that involvement. And solar pumps for irrigation is also gaining ground in a big way. And as I told you, smart meters, because India completely, it's kind of skewed to renewables now, renewable energy. So a lot of investments have been made at the cost of other sectors as well. That's another thing I just want to make. So there's not a uniform spread of things. Very new, interesting information products are coming out. IFPRI has come out with a photo-based crop insurance policy. That's very interesting. So the couple of last slides, the key constraints, what you see is inadequate capacity, outdated acts and regulations. Now, absolutely, capacity has to be at institutional level, community level. There are different levels of capacities one has to develop. That's important to pay attention to that. And we still with what the Britishers have left, to live with what the Britishers have left. Town planning acts are still what they've left. So it's important to revisit them, to kind of understand from what's happening today, from today's context, and bring some changes to that. And data quality and access is a huge access in this part of the world. It's a very huge. We don't have quality data. There should be very systematic effort to collect the right data, because what you provide as input becomes output. So it is very important to be conscious about that particular factor. Data is certainly an area where we need lots of improvement. And in India, slowly, the government agencies are opening up, but still a long way to go there. And research, investments in research is very critical. New materials coming up, and there is a huge opportunity there. And the diversity, sometimes it's a blessing for a country like India. At the same time, there are a lot of disadvantages, because India is dealing with 121 agroclimatic zones are there in India. How do you kind of really cater to this? You cannot come out, because there are microclimates existing. How do you deal with those things becomes a question. And in general, there are weak policies and institutions. Particular extension services are not functioning to the extent they're expected to. And there is another important thing is the institutional memory. That's very critical. I asked this question after 2015 floods to the corporation commissioner. We have learned so much from tsunami experience. What have we learned from that? How are we applying to this context? There is no answer, because people change, bureaucrats go away, the knowledge goes away with them. So that's important. There a sense of history is there, and institutional memory becomes very critical. One of the biggest hit during that time in 2015, when there is a incessant rain for 2 months almost, the airports are shut, everything. I spoke with the SMEs and other people who've been running this. The calendar producing industry, because it happened in November, December, completely shut off. There is no calendar, circulation of calendars for 2016 here. So that's one example of how people are affected in a big way, particularly because it's all very seasonal as well. One has to factor this as well when you look at those things. Looking ahead, again, I would strongly urge that evidence-based research is very important. Whatever we talk with conviction, because the kind of evidence you generate from the ground. And transformative approaches, as I told you earlier, there is enough about the incremental changes what we've been brought. What do you learn from that? How do you take it further? It's a big question. And for that, you need sound monitoring and evaluation and leveraging low-carbon technology. I'm not going to do the best tools. That's important to invest on tools as well. So given the fact that 70% of the urban infrastructure is yet to be built in India, provides a big window of opportunity. It applies to all the countries to build climate-resilient infrastructure. Focus on peri-urban development is also very important. And then my last slide, which talks about our own approach. It is based on count it, change it, and scale it. Anything what WRI does, first you start with the data. So that's why its publications are very popular and much sought to. So it's important to kind of understand the numbers first, and then try to kind of effect those changes through several planning processes. And then whatever is working based on the information, you could try to scale that. So there are several knowledge platforms. These are some of the examples within WRI. PREP, the Partnership for Resilience is an important platform where we're working on Resource Watch, Climate Watch. There are different frameworks like Global Forest Watch, Aqueduct. These are all in the public domain. One could really go and look at it. And we are also coming out with it also hosts a lot of secretariats like NDC platform, about 50 odd countries is part of that network. And WRI is hosting the platform for that. Now a new commission has been set up exclusively for adaptation. This is the first ever time, Global Commission on Adaptation, which is co-chaired by Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon together. So that is hopefully it will get the attention what it deserves with this commissioning coming up into play by October. So yeah, this is one reminder is for the past few decades we've been talking about endangered species and flora and fauna. Today we're living in a world that are endangered islands, and you know about it more than me. So what it means to so I think we have to get our acts together and work together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Appadurai. And I think what you said is very important and very true as well. We need to take the learnings from past experiences and take it forward in building resilience. And it's also important for us to take the learning from this platform and take it forward in how we make decisions as well. And with the permission of our presenters, the presentations will be shared on the event website.